we've already discussed understanding in other interviews. So, is understanding more valuable than knowledge, and if so, why?
Well, so a lot of people have thought that understanding just is knowledge, that is knowledge of true causes. But then there is the problem of why we value knowledge, if not to understand things. And in effect, understanding is what underwrites the desire for knowledge. I think in the context of science, and I'm really focusing on it in a very narrow context, very narrow socio-cultural context. In the context of science, understanding is an understanding of a restricted domain of phenomena that are of interest. Now, why they are of interest is something that only history and contingency can explain. There is a point at which, for example, electricity becomes of interest in the 19th century. One of the reasons is because people have worked out how to generate it, other than just rubbing glass on silk. So once you can generate it, you can do things with it, and you can measure what you do, and it goes from there. But once that's set up, understanding what electricity does becomes very important. Not because of what it's going to do down the track with electrical power generation and so forth, but just understanding the phenomena. It's something scientists in the early 19th century thought was worth knowing.
Okay.
So it's a form of underwriting of knowledge. Aristotle started out the metaphysics with the statement, "All men by nature desire to know." I think he was wrong, but I think all human beings do desire to understand some things. In fact, all things with nervous systems desire to understand some things, whether they retain it in their memory or whether they have any conscious awareness of it. Having a nervous system is about being able to understand your environment and adapt accordingly, to be able to avoid hot things, predation, find food, all those sorts of things. So really this is something that I think is very consequentialist. It comes out of what we can do when we understand. And the reason that science got going at a particular time is because at a particular time understanding the subject matter of science really began to make a difference socially. So it's kind of a primitive thing. It's something which all organisms, all human beings just have, and I think are equipped with by our evolutionary history.
I mean, how far down the phylogenetic tree would you go? Would you say something like a yeast has understanding?
Probably not. There's no nervous system. For information to play a role in a biological organism, there has to be signalling of some kind. Now within cells, you get cell signalling within cells, kinase, cascades and what have you. But that's an analog process. It's one molecule banging into another and strong or weak forces modifying the other and so forth. I would limit information transfer to between cell signals, and that starts happening the moment you get metazoans and metaphytes, that is multicellular organisms.
Right, C. elegans, for instance.
C. elegans, no doubt about it. I mean, C. elegans is actually quite a derived form of metazoan because it's got a nervous system, very rudimentary, but there's a nervous system, which means information is being passed around, which means that it's processing information in some fashion. Now, that's not a form of understanding, very primitive, almost non-existent form of understanding, but it is understanding.
In a lot of literature, understandings had taken a bit of an
anthropomorphic view,
bent. So, I mean, we have a lot of uses have been assuming the subject of understanding is a human, But what about other things? What about groups or institutions,
Well,
universities?
on my model, understanding is compressing and manipulating information to give you an outcome that is something which allows you to modify your external environment in some fashion. Groups do that, right? And the more formal a group is, more formal a discipline is, the more precise and information preservingly it does that activity. So a science student learns pretty much what their teachers learned, who learned pretty much what their teachers learned. As new technology comes in, they can do new things. As new information comes in, they can do their things. But there's a high degree of precision of transmission. So I think the idea that a group can behave like a kind of super organism or super neural network, I don't find that at all wrong. In fact, I think it's the underpinning of social organisation.
So, well, what did you, like in that paper there was like 3 thoughts or reasons to have an epistemic focus on understanding. One of them, let's deal from one by one if you don't want me to read them all out at once. One of them is that, like Duncan Pritchard advocates, that understanding is an escape from the value problem of knowledge.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, you get a kind of third man regress. Okay, so why do I want to know something? Because I want to understand it. Why do I want to understand it? Because it allows me to survive. Why do I want to survive? You can just keep going. There's no end to this. And I think this is just another problem of the grounding of evaluative terms like good, right, or just. In the end, you get to something and you say it just is. I think understanding is that final point. If you want to justify understanding, I think you're in trouble, right? Because then you have to ask, why do you want to justify that which makes it possible to justify cognition? Okay, and I think it's probably enough to say, look, that's just what we do. Right? We are that sort of thing, that sort of learning system, knowing system. It's not the only thing that understanding underpins, right? It's another reason why I don't think knowledge and understanding are coterminous. A feeling of understanding motivates investigation. And if you don't believe that, ask a 10-year-old about dinosaurs. Or spacecraft, or whatever happens to be the current obsession du jour of a certain type of 10-year-old. And I think that that psychologistic aspect of understanding, it motivates learning. Now you can ask, why do people need to motivate knowledge? I'd probably end up going with the old evolutionary epistemology view that those who don't motivate knowledge are dead. And so we need to know things in order to avoid being dead before we reproduce. Or as Willard Quine once put it, creatures inveterately wrong in their inductions have a pathetic but praiseworthy tendency to die before reproducing their kind. Right, so here's Quine in I'm not even sure when he did that, might have been 49. Here's Quine saying that all organisms that have cognitive processes going on, all of them are in need of a good epistemic foundation for their behaviours. Now this can't apply to organisms that don't have epistemic behaviours, and I certainly disagree that biofilms or bacterial colonies or whatever are cognitive or nervous systems. There are a number of people that do think that. I just think it's an overextension of the notions of cognition or problem solving or whatever. But I have no problem thinking that collectives of agents who are epistemic also understand things, which is why I said in my talk that I just gave that a discipline can understand something that no single member of the discipline understands. Right? You can have a theory which has been accepted in a discipline which isn't fully understood by any member of the discipline, but the discipline as a whole knows how to employ it. Okay?
Interesting. So that seems to tie into the third point, but given that the statement, knowledge is justified true belief, if knowledge requires justification, where does the evaluation of the justification come from?
I deny the major premise. Knowledge is not justified true belief. Knowledge is often justified and is sometimes supposed to be true. But as I said, I'm a pragmatist, and for me, knowledge is that which makes a difference in your behaviour in a successful fashion. Where do the standards of evaluation come? Well, they come from social, economic, environmental, sociological, political, biological contexts, right? And there's no such thing as a universal set of standards for these things, in my view, other than Quine's dictum that, if you get it right, you live to reproduce another day.
Understanding is central to the goal of the sciences and is considered an inextricable element of the aim of the sciences. Yes, do you agree?
I do. I absolutely do. I think that's one of the main reasons that we have science is because people do want to understand things. But that's not all it is. Science is a lot more than that, and it has a lot more motivations than understanding. I see science as an outworking of human dispositions. And when it works, we retain what works. When it doesn't work, we abandon it. Science is not, I think, qualitatively distinct from everything else we do, or for that matter, any organism that is capable of exploring its environment does. It's just more of it, more precise, better range of data, better range of processing, better techniques, better instruments, etc. And in my view, if we ended up with bats running science, we'd have a totally different way of doing science. But it would still be motivated by a need to understand the environment.
Interesting. So there's been, it's been proposed a variety of different understandings, objectual, propositional, interrogative. And since arguably we haven't really refined our language to distinguish between these different forms of understanding, it makes it difficult to deal with phrases that include them, like to understand or this, do you understand me, for instance?
Yep.
In what ways do you think we could refine the topology of understanding, or maybe close to your lingo, develop and classify a useful taxonomy of different species of understanding?
Well, Leibniz once noted of the term species, and that he meant by that logical kinds, not biological, that language was made before science got going and before science as species. That being the case, you've got to expect that pre-scientific language, or vernacular language, or natural language as it's called, isn't going to necessarily map the categories that we discover. And so what tends to happen is we dissolve those categories. Think about the term mammal. Prior to 1740, there's no such thing as mammals. Right? Now it's a term of ordinary language. But we now split mammals into artiodactyls and all of these other kinds of organisms. So what we do is we precissify, to use a philosophical term, our language over time to account for the categories that we've discovered through science. So it may very well be that understanding turns out to be a whole host of disparate cognitive operations. We'll probably still use the term in vernacular language, but we won't in, say, cognitive psychology or cognitive philosophy or machine learning or something like that. And questions like, do machines understand when they learn, will evaporate. Because everything that we do when we understand, they're doing when they understand, only in their way and to their degree. We may then say, well, maybe we don't need to talk about understanding in ordinary human behaviour as well. I'd be very interested to know to what extent cognate terms existed in widely different separated cultures. For example, I don't know, South American, Indian groups, languages, or some, sub-Saharan languages, something like that. I've got a feeling that where there's been a strong, sort of isolation between the groups, the languages will cut it up in very different ways. The stuff they don't cut up in very different ways tends to be the biological universals, with sensitivities to certain sorts of colour ranges, to certain types of auditory signals. But when it comes to something like emotions, which you might think is very biological, it turns out no. There are very, very few universals of that. And I think this is going to be true of cognition as well. So ultimately we'll get down to some level of detail and be able to say, what we used to call understanding is really process A, B and C, right, in this way. Just like we will say something like what we used to call miasma is in fact a range of different contagious and pollution influences that cause disease, right? And we've evaporated the category of miasma, which as recently as 2 centuries ago was commonly used. And that's what we'll do.
Nice. So what are some examples of different forms of understanding and how they relate to each other?
Well, Gilbert Ryle in his 1949 book, which I can't currently remember the title of, had mind in it, Ryle made a distinction in his second chapter between knowing how and knowing that. I suspect that's a pretty good first cut, but it will also apply to understanding. I understand how to do something, and I understand that something is the case. I can know that something is the case and yet not understand it. A classic example of that is the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, which for 15 minutes in the 1980s I understood. Now I still know about it, I know that it exists, and I can even tell you some of the parts of it, but I don't understand it anymore because it slipped out of my brain at some point. But I was very proud of myself. For a short while there, I understood the Krebs cycle and how it worked. There are people who understand that and people who understand how. Right? So understanding how the Krebs cycle works involves the ability to interfere with it or to manipulate it in some fashion. Right? Likewise, to understand that a computer works is very different from understanding how a computer works. If you understand how a computer works, there's all sorts of things, both nefarious and otherwise, that you can do with a computer. But understanding that it works, and maybe even how to use some aspects of it, is a very different kettle of fish. So I think that's the distinction. The other thing is, being a pragmatist, I don't think abstract knowledge is knowledge of anything other than how to do stuff in the appropriate procedural game. So knowledge of abstruse mathematical ideas like Lie groups or something like that is knowledge how to play a game with those concepts and those tools. Even if it doesn't have an extra mathematical application, it is still knowing how, right? Whereas all I know is that there are Lie groups, and I don't know how to manipulate them because I'm not a mathematician. So skills-based understanding is, I think, ultimately where you say somebody understands something.
Awesome. Okay. Well, to what extent And in which way need understanding reflect facts about what is understood?
What do you mean facts?
Facts as in, let's take your form of like fact. What about like, not knowledge, facts.
Okay. Fact is a term that covers a high degree of variant ideas. Very polysemic, as the linguists say. Traditionally, when somebody asks a question like that, what they mean is the things that are just true and which we can state are just true.
Or just the highly likely things.
Well, even that is a form of truth, isn't it? I don't think that facts in that sense are real. I think we construct facts, and again, in a pragmatist fashion, we construct facts as statements, whether symbolic or natural language, statements about the world and statements about ourselves, which are highly reliable statements which we can then act upon. Now, is that metaphysical truth or philosophical truth? No, it's not. All it is satisfactory for our purposes. And I think that's true of all cognition. So I'm denying your major premise here. Right? Facts are constructed. They're not constructed holus bolus out of nothing. They're constructed out of experience, and they are directed towards experience in that sense. So understanding is understanding how to make use of facts, or to how to fit it into a broader network of ideas that we make use of.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, if you replace the word fact with idea or belief, then yeah.
Oh, there are problems with all of those. I'm happy to talk about facts, just not to employ the objectivity notion of facts. Facts are things that human beings come up with, that they generate, and they generate them out of their experience, but they also generate them out of their context and environment. So, and they generate them in a particular language, in a particular set of beliefs, in a particular world.
Does understanding at all reflect aspects of objective aspects of the universe which are true or real?
I can't give a meaning to either of the terms, true or real, in that context. I think there's a world, and that world's independent of us, and we interact with that world, but we never grasp the world because it's way too complex. We grasp aspects of the world. Facts are those aspects that we grasp. So there's a sense that they are intersubjective, which isn't the same as objective. They are things that we share amongst ourselves in order to help ourselves deal with a world that is not ourselves. I won't go much further than that. Truth is, I think, either overrated or misunderstood. And I'd like to finish on a little anecdote. The original meaning of true was reliable. 12 good men and true, a true arrow, a true friend. Okay? Something that you can rely upon doing the same thing over and over again when you need it to, and doing it the right way. That's not the sort of Greek philosophers' sense of truth, which is more of a God's eye sense of truth. And as I'm not in direct communication with God, and nor do I believe any other philosopher is, it's very unlikely we'll ever have a good meaning to the notion of truth.
Cool. Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
How can we best make sense of the idea that understanding involves the grasp of connections?
Well, every observation, every measurement, every action that we take is connected to other things in our representation of our environment, our Umwelt, And so I'd say that understanding is having a sufficient number of connections in your representation of the world, so that it's, you know, nothing is a fact or nothing is a truth, in my sense, on its own. It can't be, right? George Moore once said, if you grant me that here is a hand, all the rest follows, and I say that's rubbish. If I grant that here is a hand, right, then all I have is a statement, here's an object, I've called it a hand. It's not in relation to anything else. Okay, the rest of the real world doesn't follow. I actually need to have experience of the world, right? And people these days talk about embodied knowledge. That's what it means. It means that you've experienced more than just the topic that you're talking about now. Because if you weren't, you couldn't even talk about it. There you go. That's me being Wittgensteinian for the day.
Nice. Thanks very much. That was awesome.